I'll now hand over the introductions to our moderator, CSA faculty member and director of the Global Legal Studies Center in the UW Law School, Dr. Sumudu Atapatu. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists today, the authors of this exciting book, Vortex, who will be talking about the book. I don't know in which order they are going, they'll decide among themselves. Jason Miklian, PhD, is a senior researcher at the Center for Development and Environment, University of Oslo. What a coincidence. I spoke at an event this morning at University of Oslo. Miklian has published over 60 academic and policy works on issues of conflict and crisis based on extensive fieldwork in Bangladesh, Colombia, India, and the Congo. He serves on the United Nations expert panel on business and human rights and has won several awards for his academic publications and serves as an expert resource for various government knowledge banks in the US, UK, EU, and Norway. He has also written for or been cited in an expert capacity by the New York Times, BBC, The Economist, Washington Post, France 24, The Guardian, The Hindu, India, and NPR. And Scott Carney is an investigative journalist and anthropologist and has worked in some of the most dangerous and unlikely corners of the world. His work blends narrative nonfiction with ethnography. His books include the New York Times bestseller, What Doesn't Kill Us, The Vortex, The Wedge, The Red Market, and The Enlightenment Trap. He met Jason at the University of Wisconsin-Madison while pursuing his PhD in anthropology. He was a contributing editor at Wired for 5 years, and his writing also appears in Mother Jones, Men's Journal, Playboy, Foreign Policy, Discover, Outside, and Fast Company. His work has been the subject of a variety of radio and television programs, including on NPR and National Geographic TV. In 2010, he won the Penn Award for Ethics in Journalism for his story, Meet the Parents, which tracked an international kidnapping to adoption ring. Carney has spent extensive time in South Asia and speaks Hindi. So with that, I welcome the two speakers to start the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us here. I mean, it's a real honor for Jason and I to be able to speak at University of Wisconsin-Madison, because this is like where we met originally in a Hindi class, just across the street from where you guys are now. And who knew that, was it 20 years later, we would be bumping around Bangladesh and you pulling on the skills that we learned at Wisconsin. So I just want to say thank you for having us, and it's super exciting. And I'd also, like to point out with the Vortex, it began as a sort of a dream of ours about 6 or 7 years ago, where there had been a lot of books about climate change in around the world, but the imminent peril that our planet faces. But it has been hard to link this abstract concept of sort of the rising sea levels and changing agrarian patterns and resource depletion to the real lived experiences. And we know that people respond to stories. As an investigative journalist, it's very apparent to me that you can put out sort of dry data into the world, and yet nothing that doesn't really hook people, doesn't get people interested, and you really need personal stories to get messages across when talking about climate change. So we had this idea that we wanted to write a book about climate change that was a nonfiction action thriller. How do you combine the great storytelling with like sort of real facts? And it's really just awesome to have the vortex out right now. And the particular journey with why we focused on the Bola cyclone and the calamitous war that happened after it. It all started in 2011 when Jason and I were working in Bangladesh on a story for foreign policy together. And I'll actually post a link to that in the message thing on the side. But we were working on this story where this young girl named Filani, who had been crossing the border between India and Bangladesh, and she was going from India to Bangladesh, and border guards shot her and killed her, and then her body hung there for, I think, 3 or 4 days. And it was this huge rallying moment for people in Bangladesh to talk about the sort of atrocity of the border wall. And, we documented that story. It was a really interesting sort of time capsule of what was, the international politics at that moment. But one of the questions going through our mind was, why would India build a wall around the entire border of Bangladesh? Bangladesh only has 2 neighbors, right? India and Myanmar. And it all tracked back to this cyclone that hit in 1970 that I really didn't know much about. I'd never really read much about it. I knew that there had been a war between India and East Pakistan in 1971, 72, but I didn't know much about it. And as we dug in, we learned that this, the storm, which was the deadliest storm in history, killed a bunch of people, killed 500,000 people in the course of a few hours, sort of set off this cascade of events that almost ended in actual global destruction with a nuclear war between the USSR and the United States. And we realized that this could be a vehicle for which to not only tell about the important history of that region, but also as an allegory for what we're all going to be facing in the future. And I'll let Jason sort of go from here.
Great. I'll be left with that. So great. No, thank you all so much for having us. And one of the things I really like about this audience in particular is not just what Scott said. I'm a Wisconsin native, did my undergrad at UW-Madison. That's where I met Scott and have all these great memories. But also this audience in particular is fantastic because, this is the real challenge where we have to bring our material to some real experts. A lot of times when we've done talks about the vortex, we kind of have to start by, first of all, showing people on a map where Bangladesh is. So the bar is set much higher here, and I hope that reflects in the questions, and I'm looking forward to getting some really good ones. But yeah, as has been presented, Scott's this fantastic investigative journalist, and I am what I think Scott called the dry data guy. I'm someone doing this, deep dive, academic, intellectually rigorous examination, and then Scott has a history of doing these amazing, riveting, investigative pieces. So one of the things that we wanted to do with this book is to see what happened when we merged those 2 skill sets together, and the vortex is the culmination of that. And we're happy to talk a little bit more about that process as well. But yeah, as we know, so we have this situation where the Great Bola cyclone hits then East Pakistan in November of 1970, and at the time was the world's greatest natural disaster, and still is. So it killed 500,000 people, and it fueled the liberation war that followed. But in a very short period of time, just 13 months later, Bangladesh won its independence. So as Scott mentioned, one of the big questions that we had was, how was this possible? And what can this teach us about the nature of resilience and how to even overcome climate disasters today, not just in Bangladesh or South Asia, but around the world? But for the vortex itself, we tell this story through a number of really exceptional characters in both positive and negative ways.
Jason,
so our story starts in
maybe it'd be useful we should not assume that everyone here knows that history of the 71 war. Maybe just give a little background before we jump into characters.
Oh, sure. I was going to do that through Nixon and Yahya and the background of Easton.
Never mind.
So
He doesn't want my notes, guys. That, okay.
no notes. And this audience might have a familiarity with that too. But yeah, so we start this because, you know, as Scott just said, like knowing that background of cultural, political histories is exceptionally important to understanding why a storm triggered a conflict. And that's why we started in 1969 in the friendship between American President Richard Nixon and Pakistani President Yahya Khan. Now, these two were just this pair of conniving drunks that they hated India. They didn't care about civilian casualties. But what Nixon wanted more than anything else in the world is to normalize relations with China. As it happened, Yahya was one of the only men in the world who was friendly with both Nixon and Mao, so they struck a deal. Yahya got boatloads and plane loads of guns to try to keep control over his population, and Nixon got an introduction with Mao, and it made them great friends. But as we all know, there were massive disparities between what were then East and West Pakistan in 1970. And these disparities traced all the way back to partition, because despite being more populous, having more amounts of capital, richer land, and more people in the East, a lot of that wealth was shifted over generations from East to West, where the political center was. So over 20 years, you had this exacerbation in income gaps, knowledge gaps, and even priority gaps. And this was the foundation behind what actually happened when the storm itself hit. Now, Scott, should I pop into one of the other characters, or do you want to take it on from here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that yeah, we can talk about characters. Like, so if we're talking about like the craft of the story, in this context, Pakistan's this divided country with a colonial, what is now Bangladesh, which was East Pakistan, was basically a colonial fiefdom of West Pakistan. And that we wanted to sort of be able to tell that story through the eyes of characters, right? So the way the genre of the book is narrative nonfiction. So it doesn't read as sort of history where we sort of get out and sort of look at facts and sort of cascade down from big pictures. We want to tell the story from the lived experiences of actual individuals. And the opening scene of the book is with this soccer star, this, I think he's about 27 years old, soccer star. His name is Hafez Uddin Ahmad, who is essentially the Pele of Pakistan. He is the best soccer player in the country. Everyone cheers for him. Everyone knows who Hafez is. But even though, Pakistan is not the, an international player, in Pakistan, he is a hero. And the opening scene is Hafez is on the football pitch, and they're playing against the Soviets. And every time Hafez gets the ball, and they're in Dhaka, so this is the capital of East Pakistan. And every time Hafez gets the ball, the entire crowd just goes crazy. And then he passes it to a teammate who is from Punjab. So on the other side of Pakistan, and the crowd goes silent. And this is something that really happened at the games that was happening there. You'd have these riotous cheers, and then you have these dead silences. And it's because since partition, it was there were all these contestations, so many angry Bengalis, so many deposed political leaders who were coming up and trying to sort of wrest for Bengali independence. East Pakistan was essentially a pot set to boil, and we're able to tell that story initially through Hafez, playing the soccer game, and then we follow his life story as he eventually joins the military, because you can't really make money as a soccer player even if you are the Pele of Pakistan. He ends up joining the military and gets swept up in the pogroms that happen after the Bola cyclone. He first sort of works as an aid relief worker, as for the army, managing the burying dead bodies and whatnot. And then after the election flips, which the Bola cyclone killed 500,000 people, it made this enormous political impact. And Yahya Khan, who was like the worst president in history, provided zero aid to the coastlines and to all the people who died. And this became an enormous electoral point where Bangladeshis could say, look, West Pakistan doesn't care about us at all. And because the election was only 2 weeks away, it ended up flipping the election the entire way, the other side towards Bangladesh, so that they actually got enough votes to control all of Pakistan. And this leads to this genocide, because Yahya Khan, who's this, wants to hold on to power. He's sort of like a Trump-like figure. He blames the fake news media. He blames the treacherous Hindus, which is what he calls East Pakistanis, it sort of just exacerbates, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And Hafez is caught up in this whole thing. He actually has to lead a mutiny against the Pakistani soldiers, because they start opening fire on Bengalis, and it's all very dramatic. And I think that the reason I'm telling you all this is because we wanted to show that the stakes of these big macro level events play out in individual lives throughout the book.
Great, thanks. And one of the other things that those of us who have read a lot of books about the 1971 war probably recognize is there tend to be a pretty substantial focus on the role of particular military people throughout that. And while those books have a tremendous amount of really rich data, what we really wanted to bring forward were the lives of more everyday people who also lived through these experiences. So I can just talk very quickly about a couple of the other characters who did that. And the first is Muhammad Hai. He was a 19-year-old kid who was living in the island of Manpura, which is right at the bottom of the Bangladesh Delta, right before it gets to the Bay of Bengal. And he was there with his family when the cyclone hit, and it killed almost every single member of the family except himself. We have a very dramatic chapter in the book talking about how he is holding on for hours to a palm tree to avoid being swept away into the sea. But what this did is it galvanized a movement within him to not only help his people, but then help his country after the genocide started taking place. And his track throughout the book is one where he begins as a relatively helpless individual, but through his own courage, through his own determination, he not only becomes a relief aid worker and helps thousands of people, thousands of survivors on his island, but also then becomes a Mukti Bahini, a resistance fighter. And the other character is one that brings in some of the more international components from a more personal level as well. And her name is Cornelia Rhodey, who was just a teacher from Boston who happened to come to Dhaka by happenstance when her husband was drafted for the Vietnam War. They didn't want to go to war, and he was a cholera doctor, so they were able to go to Dhaka as a place where they thought would be a safe refuge and safety during the war. But when the cyclone hit and she saw that Yahya did nothing for the people in terms of aid, she actually started a relief aid organization with several other individuals that became, in about 1 month, the largest private relief aid organization in history. So the book also traces her path and her ability or inability at points to try to deliver aid to people in a situation where no one else could do it for a number of different reasons, primarily because of Yahya Khan and Nixon. And then after the genocide happens, she actually goes to Washington, D.C. to take the fight directly to Nixon's doorstep. And with no experience, she's in the halls of Congress, crafting policy on typewriters and doing anything she can to try to stop this genocide from happening, to stop Nixon from giving Yahya all these guns, and to try to bring about liberation. So what we wanted to do in the book was try to bring all these different sides together. And there are times when our characters interact with each other, when they have these amazing experiences. There's one where Hafez and Yahya are together, and Yahya's only interest is finding dead bodies for photo ops and finding great places to drink his whiskey. So these are the sorts of really personal encounters that we feel bring some of this horrific details that are very often told in a more straightforward or dry bird's eye view format to ones where people can read it and really feel like, you know, they are there and that they are experiencing these events.
Yeah. And you know, it's really hard to write this book. You know, it was really hard to sort of be able to get individual voices and also tell the macro level story. So, but I wanted to, you know, just briefly sort of recount how important this Bola cyclone and the aftermath really were. Because, you know, we often, you know, we, not people in this audience, but we as in like in America, the general American conversation looks at South Asia as usually a minor player in the world. And East Pakistan, West Pakistan, like, you know, senators couldn't even find it on the map at that time. And yet the events that happened there, you know, spiral out of control and really play a role that could have literally destroyed the world. And I want to explain exactly what I mean by that, which is, so Yahya and Nixon are essentially best friends in the world. You know, they're both drunk, dictatorial people who don't mind committing genocide every now and then. And they have known each other for, I think about 10 years before they assume power, before Yahya assumes power. And as the sort of genocide that takes place, and as these conflicts get more and more serious, Nixon supplies arms to the Pakistanis. You know, he violates an embargo and brings you know, American bombs, American aircraft, American machine guns, American tanks into Pakistan in order to commit the genocide and prop up that regime. Naturally, India and Pakistan, we all know it's a pretty contested history. They just fought a war a few years before this, and India is a Soviet ally, when India finally invades, after a very really poorly planned attack by Yahya Khan, after India, Jason, where are you going? You're flying around. When India finally invades, this triggers that domino effect of Cold War alliances, and the Soviets, send a submarine fleet down into the Bay of Bengal. The Americans send the USS Enterprise from Vietnam, and they meet at this sort of arbitrary red line in the sea with Kissinger, and we have him on tape, basically saying, let's start lobbing nukes. And there are orders to destroy the Indian Air Force. This goes pretty much under the radar for the rest of the world, but these are the conversations that are happening in the halls of power at that moment. And the orders from the Americans are to sort of keep on steaming towards Dhaka, save the failing Pakistani defense. And Yahya Khan also wants a third front from China to come in and invade as well. And it gets very tense, and what the Soviets do, Soviets don't really want to start World War III over India, but they also realize that they have to sort of stand their ground. And this Soviet admiral, rear admiral named Vladimir Krugliakov, has this sort of Hunt for Red October moment, right, where he knows where the Enterprise is. He's sort of cut it off, and he does the stupidest thing that a sub-commander could ever do if you want to retain tactical superiority, and he surfaces his submarines within visual range of the American fleet that is steaming north past this line of control. And it's like sort of this message just to say, look, if you cross here, we are done. Like we're gonna launch our missiles, and who knows what happens from there. And the only reason that this doesn't actually happen is because the Indian Army and the Mukti Bahini take Dhaka, and Dhaka falls, and then they get this missive from the U.S. being like, well, I guess we shouldn't nuke the whole world. And this story, which is really underreported in the world, is startling, because you can have something like a storm, flip an election, cause political turmoil, and it escalates from one domino effect to another, all the way to literal Armageddon. Like everyone who is watching this video right now would be dead would actually be dead. I wouldn't even been born if the USS Enterprise had just steamed forward at that moment. And that is something that it's really hard to wrap your mind around, because we all think that history sort of works out, and because we're here, it was all going to be fine anyway. But that's not true. The stakes were enormous at that moment, and it all came down to the actions of like individual fighters on the front lines of the Indian Army and the Mukti Bahini, and really, really brave and courageous decisions by the Soviet fleet and the American fleet to hold their fire, despite political will from the White House to actually, escalate things.
Great, thanks. And that gets into my next point. Sorry, I had to walk to a better Wi-Fi, so you got to see the halls of my house. But one of the big takeaways that we really wanted to stress and really came about, just from watching the news over the last 5-10 years as we were writing this book, is this relationship between climate and conflict more broadly. So Scott did a great job of talking, kind of walking us through to that point where we are almost at the brink of international conflict. But one of the things we do through the book is show each step of that process and the decisions that policymakers made to escalate instead of to try to de-escalate. So I think that, for today, like, a lot of people ask, what does this mean for South Asia today? But more broadly, what does this mean about the relationship between climate change and conflict today? And I think that Bangladesh's birth can teach us a lot about, not only the resilience and overcoming disasters, but also how the political systems can make a major difference in what happens when a megastorm or a disaster hits. Because it's political and not technical issues that really become the biggest threat to effective disaster response. And we have seen this in Syria, we've seen it in Ethiopia, we've seen it in many different countries around the world, where you have this uncaring leader who refuses to give aid to a political group or some rivals that they don't like. And then that actually can trigger conflict. But in many places, these systems aren't in place to handle either technical or political challenges. And then we saw this even just a few years back in Myanmar with Cyclone Nargis, and how that helped facilitate the Rohingya genocide. Now, this is all to say that, one of the questions we often get asked is like, okay, yeah, but this is Bangladesh, or, if a storm hits today in Mozambique, it's not going to trigger an international conflict. But in 1968 and 1969, nobody in the United States, least of all Richard Nixon, thought that East Pakistan was going to be, a place for his last stand, a place that he would even care about at all. But when you have storms that hit regions, it crosses political boundaries, and then one by one, nations can get sucked into the conflict. And this is something where, it's a different conflict, different type of story, but you see in Russia's invasion of Ukraine today, how easy it is for countries to get involved in a conflict and perhaps beyond the point in which they are comfortable. And then, politicians are fallible, egos get involved, no one wants to back down. And de-escalation at that point is 100 times more difficult than it is, especially when a disaster hits, if aid is actually given at the time when it matters. And it's important because, as we all know, climate change is exacerbating the intensity and frequency of storms, and they are hitting in new places. So each storm is a roll of the dice for conflict, and it can expand far beyond where anyone anticipates. So we talk about this a little bit in the afterword about the relationship between the story of the book and how it's relevant today. But this is something that we feel is also really, really important, and something that we can learn from Bangladesh's experience and history that can help us avoid anything similar happening today.
I mean, that was really well said, Jason. I think that you've sort of like, we've hit the main points of the things we wanted to talk about here, right? I will say that what is eerie for when we were writing this book, we began thinking about it in about I want to say 2015, right? And we had no clue that Donald Trump would be president at one point. When we were pitching this book, when we were sort of outlining all of our ideas, we're like, there's that he was just a sideshow. And then watching him come into power and then seeing the parallels with even just the personality traits with this dictatorial Yahya Khan at that time was horrifying. And, history doesn't exactly, this is the old saying, right? History doesn't repeat, it rhymes, but it's rhyming really, really well, right? And all the way up to the point where we have this election fiasco that happens in America. The only reason we did, when Yahya Khan had the same election fiasco, when he denied the results of the election, he decided to shoot people. And I think the only reason that one maybe not the only reason, but a major reason why Trump wasn't able to do that is because he didn't have the same control over the military. I don't really feel like he would have been against it entirely, since he's calling for civil war now. I think that it's terrifying to look back into this past and realize that what happens in South Asia can repeat all around the world, and it's important to take these lessons and buy our book. Yeah, and buy our book.
Yeah, well, we got just a couple of minutes. So one thing I could talk about that might be of value for this audience in particular is, I know a lot of your events have authors who do some quite serious books, and ones that have a really strong, theoretical or academic background to them. I would make the case that our book has that as well. It's the bones of our book. We've done probably 4 years of research, primary, secondary materials, nearly 1,000 sources in total if you add up all the interviews and documents that we looked at. So the bones of this book, and you see this in the long list of references and stuff in the back, are very much a typical history academic book. And our big challenge, and this is where Scott really shined, is in being able to tell these amazing, vivid true life stories, and then kind of pepper in the knowledge that, let's say, a typical American would need to know, but not putting in so much of that knowledge that they get turned off. So, I mean, we have early drafts of the book where, there's pages of the nonsense that I go off on with all this esoteric background. Well,
that's actually a really useful point to sort of highlight here, is that, I came from academia, and I got to ABD in anthropology at University of Wisconsin, and one of the things that I think academics struggle with, both emotionally and professionally, is having their work recognized by the outside world. I mean, academia can be very insular, and you can spend years on a project that 5 people will ultimately read. Sometimes it doesn't work like that, but very frequently, academia becomes so inward gazing that it doesn't engage with the outside world. And one of the really nice things about what we have been able to do is bring a really high caliber of research, while at the same time thinking about outreach and thinking about, how do you tell a story, which is vitally important to South Asianists, right? And vitally important to historians, but try to get, the average reader who might only pick up Tom Clancy books, how do you get them engaged in this endeavor? And I think that there's often a lacuna and even a reticency, I don't know how to pronounce that word, a reticence, God damn it. Yes, that it's difficult for academics to want to be popular, to engage with the popular press, and that is a problem, right? Because we want, one of the reasons why anthropology wants to exist is because it wants to be relevant in the world. We want decision makers to listen to the research that is being done, but the only way you can do that is by telling stories that people want to listen to, which I think people are academics are often very hesitant to want to engage. So it's been a really interesting relationship with Jason and I, because we had that fight over, I'm like, we need to pump this up, and he's like, no, we need to be measured here, and that's sort of a constant tension in our relationship, and I think that ultimately it made the work much better, because I very much benefited from Jason's ability to dig out sources that I would never have gone into. And on the other hand, Jason benefits from the ability to frame stories in a way that a popular audience would care about.